Hi there. Welcome back from spring break. This is Dr. Coates, and this is the first of two lectures on Imagism that I'll be giving this week. I consider it to be one of the most fascinating sets of poems that have to deal with imagery, and so that was one of my reasons. It also happens to be a school of poetry that I've published on. Not that I'm expecting anybody to have read any of that, but it is one of my central areas of expertise. I've given you a sort of Whitman sampler of Imagism, which, as if you've looked at any of these, you'll see immediately they're really, really short. So it's extremely easy and quick to get through all the poems, at least on an initial read, which I would suggest you do before you listen to this or read through the transcript again. I also want to make absolutely clear that you know that when I say Imagism, I'm not talking about a poem that uses imagery, because most poems do. But I'm talking about a coherent school of poetry that was practiced by relatively few individuals at the beginning of the 20th century in Britain and America. As you know, this is a general poetry class, and I'm not trying to provide you with any sort of comprehensive knowledge or understanding of literary history, although I do tend to slip things in now and then. Still, a class on visual poetry ought to have some sort of coverage of Imagism, I should think, since it was the first of a very small set of intensely visual movements within poetry. And we are going to cover one or two more of those in this class. So if you tell people I took a class on visual poetry, they would probably expect you to know about Imagism. So that's one of the reasons why we're doing it. So today I'm going to give you a broad overview of Imagism and Imagist poetry in general. Thursday I'm going to go into more detail about the history of the school, what its practitioners thought that they were doing by writing poetry in this particular way, and some of the many consequences of this style of writing poetry and the way that it uses its images. Okay, so that's sort of a preview of coming attractions for Thursday. As the name implies, every Imagist poem contains a central image, usually just one. Although it is possible to have a long Imagist poem, in which case, of course, you would expect there to be several, probably divided by different stanzas. But of course, poems that don't tend to associate, but of course, poems that we don't tend to associate with Imagism can also convey an image, or even work primarily through imagery, or even just have one image in them. So what separates Imagist poems from other poems that are notable for their use of images? The main answer is that every Imagist poem is trying to redefine the way that you normally approach imagery. They were all written shortly before or right after the outbreak of World War I, when the arts and sciences were beginning to focus on individual subjectivity in a way that they really hadn't before. Sigmund Freud's revolutionary writings in psychology, for example, were pushing theorists of the mind to reconceive of their models for personality and character, and to admit that not everybody shared exactly the same sort of consciousness. And this may seem like a sort of an odd statement to make, but of course this is over 100 years after this particular movement. And we live in a far more tolerant age than people did in the early 1900s. So it's kind of second nature for us to say, yes, people are different. People learn differently. People express themselves differently. And this is actually something that we tend to celebrate now rather than to get really nervous about it. But that was not the case 100 years ago. It's nevertheless true that consciousness had not been an object of study for the sciences in quite the emphatic way that it became studied in the early 1900s. Furthermore, this new movement that Freud started, called psychoanalysis, based much of its inductive investigation on the language that their parents used to describe their symptoms. And in a sense, there's really no way to distinguish between manifestations of the mind and the language that people can use to convey those manifestations, right? Because you're really not looking at a brain. And even if you were able to look at a brain, it's not like there's useful information, to be found by looking at brains. I don't know if you tried to do this before, or if you looked at Wikipedia and saw like the biological schematics for what a brain looks like. We're getting better with like MRI mapping, and you can get like color-coded maps of where in the brain certain types of thought take place. But even so, cognitive scientists really have a lot to do and a long way to go before we will understand how the brain works. So Freud did a very reasonable thing by saying, let's have our patients talk to us, and then we'll make deductions based on what they say. Having said that, there's really no way to parse the language from the thought. Language is thought at a really fundamental level. All of these advancements in psychology coincided with largely pseudoscientific theories about decadence, cultural degeneration, and scientific racism. Just outright wrong social Darwinist crap that tied deviant or abnormal psychology to broad cultural anxieties about national, and in Britain's case at least, imperial decline. Right? So they were worried about the fact that like, the British character was no longer as upright as they thought it should have been, and they were looking at some of these deviants and freaks and saying, well, perhaps it's because of them. Like if some of our our nobles and aristocracy are becoming wastrels and dilettantes, maybe it's because we are degenerating as a culture, right? So that's what I mean by that anxiety. And it has everything to do with the lack of tolerance that I was just talking about too. So the Imagist poets, who I'm not trying to say were degenerates, but I am trying to say that many middle class and mainstream readers in British culture, British and American culture, might have looked at them and said, "You're an artist? Oh, a poet, eh? Yes. Why don't you get a real job? You're a degenerate." So the poets that are writing the Imagist poems knew that they were thought of in that way by many in their readership. And they're operating in a climate in which the reading public was readier than they had ever been before to bracket an observation that they would read within a poem by the speaker. Okay, now by bracket, what I mean is that they were going to read the poem ironically, and to test the observations that the speakers make against how they themselves, the readers, might have seen it. Okay, and not to use the deviation of the speaker's senses from their own as a reason to dismiss or reject the poem, but as, in some ways, the selling point, the entire reason why the text is interesting, right? They're either looking for reasons to get more and more anxious about the decline of their culture, right? Like, aha, that's what it is, the aha moment. Or they're just fascinated by ways in which people deviate from the norm in ways that they had never thought to be fascinated before. So if you're a fan of the arts, an analogy I can make is to Vincent van Gogh, who is an impressionist painter. In some ways, Imagism is quite a bit related to our impressionism in the visual arts, but it was a slightly older movement. It happened in the late 19th century, in the late 1800s. So, but if you know anything about Van Gogh, you probably know the story about him cutting off his ear and mailing it to his beloved. I'm not saying that that's a good idea. Or that necessarily makes you crazy, although it's probably not a normal thing to do, nor is it healthy to cut your ear off. Anyway, much of the interest of Van Gogh's final paintings, was sparked by that story of his insanity and his deviancy. And for successors of Van Gogh in the visual arts, like, say, for example, Pablo Picasso, whose Cubist paintings look even less like the real scenes that he was representing than Van Gogh's did, if you've ever seen Starry Night, for example, you can make out that that's supposed to be a night sky. If Picasso had done it, it would be a bunch of weird lines. And it would not have, things like, what do you call it? Perspective. Sorry about that. This is why I do literature and not the visual arts. Anyway, in order for somebody like Picasso to sell his paintings, to reach an audience in the artistic marketplace, there had to be buyers out there interested in showing off works that attested to unique ways of seeing, and sometimes, I want to make the argument, the odder the better. They're actually looking for the freaks in order to hang on their wall. So that perhaps is not a taste that you yourselves have, but I just need you to buy the idea that folks did have that taste, at least some people, enough people to make it a worthwhile living for these artists. So when you read an Imagist poem, know that you are probably entering a consciousness that had never existed within literature before, and that part of the point of the poem is this implicit argument that this sort of mind ought to be included within English letters, that this is a consciousness that should be represented by poetry. Maybe if you or I had been in the Paris metro on the day that Pound's speaker felt that all of those faces mingled together as an apparition in the poem in the station of the metro, maybe that wouldn't have happened for us, but it happened for him, and it's our job as his reader to figure out how that could have happened. Right? Maybe if we look down from whichever mountain the Oread and HD's Oread is looking down from, we would not similarly have felt the need to taunt the sea, to whirl up its pines and splash them on the rocks. But then I'm not an immortal Greek nymph made out of mountain, so it might take me some adjustment to figure out how she sees things and to recognize that it's probably going to be different than the way that I would see them. Right? Maybe I really, really needed to have been there on the scene to figure out why so much depends on that red wheelbarrow in the William Carlos Williams poem of the same name. Maybe I needed to have been standing in 3 feet of snow in Connecticut to get the speaker's emotional state in Wallace Stevens' The Snowman, and etc. Nevertheless, it's also true that every Imagist poem gives you enough information to make an informed judgment about what's going on, who the person is, and how they probably differ from you in an appreciable way that will force you to adjust what you would normally do with their images once you figure out how you and the speaker are different. You're always given that information. It's never a mystery. It is in fact like reading a mystery really short mystery, excuse me, a really short mystery, maybe a short story or something like that, where all the clues are given to you, and your job, instead of having Sherlock Holmes in the story, your job is to put all the pieces together yourself. But it's never something that will defy your interpretation. Having said that, it's also true that Imagist poems are, as a rule, very short. This doesn't mean that they are lacking in evidence, but it does mean that the things we are provided with are sort of supercharged with meaning, if only because there seems to be so little to work with, right? We have clues, not many, right, but enough to figure out who done it. In Pound's poem In a Station of the Metro, for example, which is only 2 lines, 3 if you count the title, right? You got to use the information in the title. It's not a guess that he's standing in Paris looking at the subway. We know that. It was written in 1911. This was before the DC Metro was constructed, and apart from DC, that's the only other subway that's called the Metro, right? Paris. The Paris subway is the only one on Earth in 1911 that went by that name. London, for example, where Pound was living at the time, called their subway the Underground, or in some cases unaffectionately, it was called the Tube. New York is just the subway. It's important to take the hint when we see it. Okay? Similarly, H.D.'s Oread does not make sense if you don't bother to look up Oread in the title and realize that this is an Oread talking to you. It just doesn't. You'll be able to get some stuff out of it, but it's really essential that you recognize that this is like somebody speaking to you from ancient Greece, and that she is not human. Imagist authors leave you clues and expect you to puzzle out the image. In that sense, even though the brevity of the lyric might suggest that we have more license to picture the scene, that we have more freedom, right, to imagine, these particular pine trees, this particular mountain, right? There's actually a lot less agency left up to us as readers, since our role is to reconstruct the original situation that the speaker experienced, rather than to vicariously inhabit it ourselves. Since the point is that we're probably not all that much like the speaker, and perhaps never could be. Right? I'll talk more about these consequences on Thursday, but for now, I wanted you to know that you will be initially rebuffed by an Imagist poem. You'll be like, what the hell just happened? Or, who is this person? That makes no sense, right? But you must persevere. You can reason it out eventually. It's not sufficient to just leave it alone and think, well, I'm glad I'm not a snowman, or it must be interesting to be an Oread, but I'll never understand this because I can't become her, right? It is still possible to sympathize with them enough to figure out what's going on, and in fact that's your duty. Also, I would point out, because they are so short, it's not going to hurt you at all to reread it until you figure out what's going on. So I also wanted to note that Katrina and John are 2 of our fake poets for this week, and they have graciously agreed to be the speakers of Oread and In a Station of the Metro, respectively. So I strongly suggest that you all respond at least once to both of them on Twitter to help you practice what to do with Imagist poetry for the exam at the end of this module. And I'll be sure to spend a lot of time on Twitter this week too to see how we're doing and to redirect conversations if they need to be redirected. So that's all for today. Again, I'll have more on Thursday about the more specific history, tactics, strategies, and arguments of Imagist poetry. Take note of what I say in the email that houses this video, and check in again on Thursday for more. Okay, thank you. Bye.